There's a specific kind of loneliness that happens when you are sitting in a room full of people and you realize you are the only one who is paying attention to the undercurrent. You sense the tension before it speaks. You notice the sadness behind the smile that everyone else accepts as genuine. You carry a quiet gravity that others call wisdom, but which you know intimately is simply exhaustion wearing a very convincing mask. You've always felt older than your years, not in the way that precocious children are praised for being clever, but in the way that a house feels old, not because of its architecture, but because too many storms have passed through it without anyone bothering to repair the damage. And you have built a life around this feeling, a responsible life, a serious life, a life where you are the one who holds things together, the one who anticipates the crisis, the one who remains calm while everyone else falls apart. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it feels like a prison you designed yourself without realizing you had the option to build something else. If this is familiar, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily, bodily reality, then what you're about to hear may explain something you have never been able to name. You have probably been called an old soul more times than you can count, and you probably accepted the label because it felt like the only one that fit. But according to the psychological framework of Dr. Gabor Maté, being an old soul is not a mystical designation. It is not a spiritual advantage. It is, very often, the trace left on a child who was forced to become an adult before they were ever allowed to be a child. The life you're living right now, the schedules, the obligations, the role you play, was built for that adapted, prematurely aged self. It was built for the survivor, but it was never built for the authentic person underneath. And the fiction between those two realities is what makes ordinary life feel so extraordinarily exhausting for you. We need to reframe what we mean when we say someone is an old soul. The phrase is usually offered as a compliment. It implies depth, perspective, a quiet understanding of the human condition that transcends the noise of everyday life. And all of that may be true about you. But Mate's work asks a deeper question. Where did that depth come from? In his framework, depth is often born from necessity. A child who grows up in an environment where the adults are emotionally unstable, absent, or overwhelmed does not get to remain a child. They are thrust into the role of the observer, the interpreter, the emotional regulator. They learn to read the room because their safety depends on it. They develop a profound understanding of human suffering because they are immersed in it from birth. They acquire what looks like wisdom because they have had to navigate complexity that should never have been placed on a young nervous system. This is not a gift. This is an adaptation. And it is an adaptation that comes with a profound cost. The cost is that you learn to carry the weight of the world before you learn to carry your own body. You learn to understand others before you were ever given the chance to understand yourself. You learn to be old before you were ever given the permission to be young. And so you move through adulthood with a strange, persistent sense that the structures of normal life, the career ladder, the social rituals, the milestones of achievement, were designed for a different kind of person. A person with the luxury of taking things at face value. A person whose nervous system was calibrated for progress rather than survival. A person who does not feel the hidden grief that pulses beneath every ordinary interaction. You are living a life that was built for the world's timeline, not yours. And the signs of this mismatch are everywhere if you know how to look for them. Here are the 9 signs that you're an old soul living a life that was never built for you. The first sign is that you feel responsible for other people's emotional states before you even register your own. You walk into a space and your first instinct is not to find your place in it, but to assess its safety. You check the emotional temperature. You monitor the unspoken dynamics. And without even deciding to do it, you begin adjusting your own behavior to soothe, stabilize, or accommodate the people around you. From a trauma-informed perspective, this is one of the most defining characteristics of the parentified child. The child who was made, implicitly or explicitly, responsible for the emotional well-being of the adults in their life. Gabor Maté describes this as a profound distortion of the natural order. The child should be receiving care. Instead, they are providing it. And they carry this orientation into every relationship they enter as an adult. You do not choose to be this way. Your nervous system learned early that your safety was contingent on the emotional stability of others. So it developed an extraordinary capacity for attunement. You became an emotional radar system, constantly scanning, constantly adjusting, constantly preempting the needs of others so that you could maintain the fragile equilibrium of your environment. The reframe here is crucial. This is not a personality trait. This is not you being overly empathetic or inherently selfless. This is a survival mechanism that was wired into your nervous system before you had language to describe what you were doing. It was intelligence in service of survival. And it remains active even now in environments where it is no longer necessary, draining your energy, obscuring your own needs, and making you feel as though the primary purpose of your existence is to manage the inner lives of others. The second sign is that you find the conventional milestones of adulthood deeply unmotivating. The promotion, the house, the title, the accumulation of status symbols that society uses to measure a successful life. You can execute these things. You are often remarkably good at them because the adaptive self is highly competent at performing what the world expects. But achieving them feels hollow, not because you're ungrateful or overly idealistic, but because your nervous system was never calibrated for acquisition. It was calibrated for safety. When your early environment was unstable, your developmental energy went towards survival, not toward the natural exploration and ambition that a securely attached child develops. You did not dream about what you could build. You worried about what might collapse. And so the goals that motivate a person whose baseline is safety, the pursuit of more, the drive to conquer, the hunger for recognition, feel to you like distractions from the deeper, unaddressed question that has always lived beneath your achievements. Am I actually safe? Am I actually allowed to be here? This is why you can reach a milestone that others envy and feel nothing but a strange, quiet emptiness. The life you build satisfies the world's criteria, but it does not satisfy your nervous system's criteria, because your nervous system is still operating on a different set of priorities entirely. The third sign is that you cannot remember a time when you felt truly young or carefree. When you look back on your childhood, what you remember is not play. What you remember is vigilance. You remember being the one who noticed when things were about to go wrong. You remember being the one who stayed quiet to avoid triggering a conflict. You remember being the one who comforted, who mediated, who held space for adults who should have been holding space for you. Psychologists have observed that children who are forced into this role lose access to their own developmental needs. Play, the spontaneous, unstructured, joyful activity that is the natural work of childhood, requires a sense of safety that you never had. Play requires the luxury of not watching, not listening, not bracing, and you could never afford that luxury. So you grew up without it, and you grew into an adult who does not know how to rest without guilt, how to be silly without shame, how to take up space without first calculating how that space impacts others. You became someone whose baseline state is observation rather than participation. You watch life happen. You facilitate life for others, but you do not immerse yourself in it with the unself-conscious joy that comes from having been allowed at some crucial point in your development to simply be a child. This is not a character flaw. This is the result of a developmental interruption. And the grief you may feel when you witness other adults who can play, who can be light, who can let go, that grief is the acknowledgement of something you were denied, not something you failed to develop. The fourth sign is that you crave silence and depth, but feel guilty for withdrawing from the noise. The social world, as it is commonly constructed, the small talk, the networking, the performative enthusiasm, the demand to be visibly engaged and continuously responsive, is an environment that taxes your nervous system at a fundamental level. You do not dislike people, but you require depth, you require substance, you require interactions that acknowledge the complexity of human experience, not interactions that bypass it in favor of superficial connection. And when you withdraw from the noise, which you must do regularly in order to restore your capacity to function, you feel a persistent guilt. Because the world tells you that withdrawing is avoidance, that needing silence is antisocial, that wanting depth instead of breadth is the symptom of something being wrong with you. But Maté's work offers a different understanding. Your need for depth and withdrawal is the nervous system's attempt to regulate an input level that was never designed for it. A child who grew up in an emotionally loud environment, an environment where the subtext was always screaming, even when the volume was low, develops a sensitivity to noise that goes far beyond the physical. You are not just hearing sound. You are processing emotional data at a rate that most people do not even perceive. Your withdrawal is not avoidance, it is preservation. It is the act of a nervous system that knows, from experience, that too much unprocessed input leads to collapse. And the guilt you feel about it is just the old attachment anxiety resurfacing. The fear that if you stop performing social availability, you will lose the connection you have worked so hard to maintain. The fifth sign is that you feel a strange, acute grief when you see children being genuinely nurtured. This is one of the most telling signs and one of the most difficult to admit. When you witness a parent kneeling down to meet a child at eye level, when you see a child's fear met with genuine comfort rather than dismissal, when you watch a family operate with the easy warmth of people who assume safety is a given, something in your chest cracks, not because you are jealous, not because you are resentful, but because you're recognizing in real time what was supposed to happen for you. You're seeing the baseline that every child deserves, and you're seeing with devastating clarity what you were given instead. Maté describes this recognition as one of the most painful thresholds in healing, because it forces you to confront the fact that your early experience was not just difficult, it was fundamentally unjust. You were not prepared for the world by people who loved you without condition. You were prepared for the world by people whose love was contingent, unpredictable, or simply absent. And the grief of that recognition is not a passing emotion. It is the structural adjustment. It is the moment when your nervous system finally allows itself to acknowledge the scale of what was lost. This grief is not weakness. It is the beginning of honesty. And it is necessary because you cannot build a life that fits you until you fully understand why the life you have never felt like it did. The sixth sign is that people call you wise, but you feel like you just know what pain looks like. You are often sought out for advice. People tell you that you see things clearly, that you have a perspective that cuts through the noise, that you understand the human heart in a way that feels uncommon. And you accept this praise because it is true, you do understand. But the understanding did not come from study. It did not come from contemplation. It came from immersion. You know what pain looks like because you lived inside it. You know what confusion feels like because you navigated it without a map. You know what people need when they are suffering because you learned to identify those needs in the people around you long before you were ever taught to identify them in yourself. This is the paradox of the old soul. What looks like wisdom from the outside is scar tissue from the inside. You are not illuminated by some transcendent light. You're illuminated by the fires you had to walk through to survive. And while that survival gave you a profound capacity for understanding others, it left a hollow space where your own unaddressed suffering still lives. The reframe is this: your wisdom is real, it is valuable, It is a direct consequence of the intelligence your nervous system developed in impossible conditions. But it does not require you to continue carrying the pain that generated it. You can offer your understanding to others without perpetually sacrificing your own healing in the process. The seventh sign is that you struggle to ask for help because you were always the one offering it. Your identity was built around capability, around being the one who holds, who manages, who anticipates. And this identity served a crucial function in childhood. It gave you a role. In an environment where you felt fundamentally unsafe, being useful was the closest thing to security you could find. If you were needed, you would not be abandoned. If you were competent, you would not be rejected. But this strategy has a devastating long-term consequence. It makes receiving help feel like a threat to your attachment. Because if your value in relationships is based on what you provide, then needing something, asking for something, calls that value into question. The underlying fear wired into your nervous system decades ago is that if you stop being the one who gives, you will lose the reason people stay. So you carry things alone, you manage crises privately, you suffer in silence and call it independence. And you build a life that reflects this orientation, a life where you are constantly supporting others, but rarely letting yourself be supported. A life that was built for the caretaker, not for the person who also needs care. According to Maté, learning to receive, learning to let others hold you, even imperfectly, even temporarily, is one of the most difficult and most transformative steps in healing from this pattern. Because it requires you to challenge the fundamental premise your survival was built on, the premise that your needs are a liability. They are not, they are a birthright. And a life that does not accommodate them is a life that was never built for you. The eighth sign is that you feel like you're waiting for a life that has not started yet. This is the most disorienting sign of all. Because you have a life, you have responsibilities, relationships, a history, a present. But somewhere beneath the surface of all of it, there's a persistent, quiet sense that you're in a holding pattern. That the real thing, the life you were meant to live, the person you were meant to be, has not yet begun. This feeling is not a fantasy. It is not escapism. It is the authentic self, buried under decades of adaptation, signaling that it is still there. It has not died. It has not given up. It is simply waiting, waiting for the conditions in which it can finally emerge. And those conditions are not external. They are not a different job, a different city, a different partner. The conditions the authentic self needs are internal. It needs safety. It needs permission. It needs the cessation of the constant, exhausting project of managing the world so that you can survive it. The life you're waiting for is not somewhere else. It is underneath the life you have right now. And accessing it does not require you to abandon your responsibilities or destroy your current structures. It requires you to begin within those structures to carve out small spaces where the authentic self can breathe. To say one honest thing where you would have said something accommodating. To take one rest where you would have pushed through. To feel one feeling where you would have analyzed it away. Each of these small acts is a renovation, a modification of the existing structure so that it begins to fit the person who actually lives inside it. And over time, the holding pattern begins to dissolve, not because you found a new life, but because you allowed the old one to finally accommodate you. The ninth sign is the deepest one. It is the one most people refuse to see in themselves, because seeing it requires acknowledging the full extent of what the adaptation cost you. You are terrified of who you would be if you finally let yourself rest. Not just rest your body, rest your vigilance. Rest your constant monitoring of the emotional environment. Rest the project of being competent, being wise, being the one who holds it all together. Rest the entire apparatus of survival that has been running day and night since you were old enough to understand that no one was going to hold it together for you. The terror is real. Because if you stop performing the old soul, if you stop being the deeply understanding, endlessly accommodating, quietly suffering anchor of every room you enter, what is left? What happens if the radar turns off? What happens if you stop anticipating the needs of others and start acknowledging your own? What happens if you let the gravity go and allow yourself to be, for the first time in your life, light? The fear is that without the adaptation, you will be exposed, that people will see that underneath the wisdom is exhaustion, that underneath the capability is a child who was never given the chance to just be a child, that underneath the old soul is someone who is desperately, achingly young and who has been waiting decades for permission to show it. But here is what Maté's work makes clear. That young person underneath the adaptation is not a liability. They are the source of everything that makes you extraordinary. The depth, the sensitivity, the capacity for connection, the understanding of human pain. All of these came from that young, vulnerable self who had to absorb the world's weight before they were ready. The adaptation gave you the armor, but the authentic self gave you the heart. And a life built only for the armor is a life that protects you from the world while keeping you permanently separated from yourself. Stop, just for a moment. Stop the reflex to analyze this, to turn it into another piece of wisdom you can offer to others, while quietly excluding yourself from its implications. You are not reading this for someone else. You're reading this for you. The life you have built is impressive. The person you have become is extraordinary. But none of that eliminates the fact that you were a child who had to grow up too fast, in an environment that did not support the pace, and who has been carrying the consequences of that acceleration ever since. You are not broken. You were never broken. You were accelerated. You were compressed. You were forced into a shape that fit the needs of others. And you have been living inside that shape so long that you have forgotten it was not your original form. The original form is still there. The child who never got to play. The person who needs help but was taught that needing it was dangerous. The authentic self who has been waiting patiently and persistently for the day when the survival mechanisms would finally stand down and the real life could begin. That day is not a destination. It is a decision. A decision to stop building a life that only accommodates the armor and to start making room, small, terrifying, necessary room for the person who lives underneath it. This does not mean abandoning your responsibilities. It does not mean discarding your wisdom. It means extending that wisdom inward. It means applying the extraordinary capacity for understanding that you've always offered to others, to yourself. It means recognizing that the old soul is not your entire identity. It is the part of you that was forged in fire and the part of you that now deserves to step out of the furnace and feel the cool air. You will still be wise. You will still be deep. But you will also be rested. You will also be held. You will also be allowed to be young, even if your youth comes late, and even if it looks different from the youth you see in others. Because youth is not an age, it is a state of the nervous system. It is the state of feeling safe enough to stop watching, stop calculating, stop managing, and start simply being present without an agenda. And that state is available to you, not as a fantasy, not as a distant promise, but as a series of small daily choices to prioritize your own reality over the performance of your survival. If this kind of understanding feels like something worth returning to, consider subscribing so these conversations can continue to find you when the noise of the adapted life gets too loud and you need a reminder that the quiet underneath it is who you really are. And I want to ask you, genuinely, which of these 9 signs made you feel most seen? Which one names something you have been carrying without a name for the longest time? Leave it in the comments, not as a performance of your wisdom, but as an act of your authenticity. Because sometimes the bravest thing an old soul can do is simply admit what they have been feeling all along. I will leave you with this. You were never meant to carry the weight of the world. You were meant to carry the weight of your own life, a life that was supposed to be supported, nurtured, and held by the people around you, so that you could grow at your own pace, in your own time, into your own shape. That support was not given to you, so you built to shape yourself. And the shape you built is remarkable. It is strong, it is perceptive, it is deeply human, but it is heavy. And you are allowed to set it down, not all at once, not completely, but piece by piece, moment by moment, choice by choice. You are allowed to let the armor loosen. You are allowed to let the vigilance soften. You are allowed to build a life that fits the person you actually are, not just the person you had to become to survive. The life that was never built for you can be rebuilt by you, for you. And the person who does the rebuilding is not the old soul who carried the weight. It is the authentic self who finally, bravely decides they no longer have to.